So there I was, Captain Jake Morrison, sitting in the cockpit of my cargo hauler Lucky Break, and yes, the irony of that name was not lost on me, wondering how exactly my life had gone so spectacularly off the rails that I was now running supply drops in the armpit of the galaxy. Captain Morrison, came the overly cheerful voice of my AI co-pilot, Bert. We're approaching the debris field from yesterday's skirmish. Shall I plot a course around it? Nah, Bert, let's fly straight through it. I love dodging chunks of exploded spaceship with my morning coffee. I took another sip of what could generously be called coffee and was more accurately described as caffeinated regret. Of course, plot around it, you digital donut. The war between the galactic hegemony and the Zephyrian Empire had been dragging on for 3 years now, and honestly, calling it a war was being generous. It was more like watching two cosmic toddlers fight over who got the bigger sandbox, except the toddlers had planet-killing weapons and serious anger management issues. The Zephyrians were basically what you'd get if you took a lion, made it 8 feet tall, gave it opposable thumbs, and then spent a few million years convincing it that everything in the universe existed solely for its personal entertainment. They had this whole warrior culture thing going on. Honor, strength, the sacred hunt, blah blah blah. Very impressive, very deadly, very exhausting to be around. Captain, Bert interrupted my philosophical musings about alien psychology. I'm detecting a faint distress signal from the debris field. Zephyrian origin. Great. Just great. I set down my coffee and started pulling up scanner data. Let me guess, some hotshot pilot thought they could take on a hegemony dreadnought single-handed and learned a valuable lesson about physics. Actually, sir, the signal appears to be coming from an escape pod. And Captain, the life signs are unusual. I should have known right then that my day was about to get significantly worse. In my experience, unusual was code for congratulations, Jake, you're about to make a decision that will haunt you for the rest of your natural life. But did I listen to that little voice in my head? Of course not. 20 minutes later, I was suited up and floating through a graveyard of twisted metal, following Bert's directions to what looked like a Zephyrian escape pod that had seen better decades. The thing was barely holding together, and I could hear something moving around inside. All right, Bert, pop the hatch and let's see what fresh hell we're dealing with today. The hatch cracked open with a hiss of escaping atmosphere, and 3 pairs of enormous golden eyes stared up at me. 3 Zephyrian cubs. Now, I should probably mention that Zephyrian cubs look like someone took a kitten, fed it nothing but protein shakes and steroids for 6 months, then gave it retractable claws that could punch through titanium. They were about the size of large dogs, covered in silver and black striped fur, and making these little chirping sounds that were probably adorable if you ignored the rows of very sharp teeth. Oh, come on, I muttered into my comm. Really? This is what my life has become? Cosmic babysitting? The largest of the 3 cubs, and by largest I mean it was probably only capable of mauling me instead of completely eviscerating me, tilted its head and made a sound that was somewhere between a purr and a growl. Then, because apparently the universe had a sense of humor, all 3 of them started trying to climb out of the pod toward me. I said, backing away slowly. Please tell me you have some kind of protocol for this situation in your databanks. I'm afraid not, Captain. Although I should mention that according to Zephyrian cultural databases, cubs this young typically imprint on the first adult they encounter after a traumatic separation from their parents. I watched in growing horror as 3 apex predator babies decided that I, Jake Morrison, delivery boy extraordinaire, was now their new daddy. Perfect, I said, as the cubs started making happy little chirping noises and attempting to follow me back to my ship. Just perfect. Bert, remind me to update my resume. Apparently I'm adding interspecies childcare to my list of qualifications. 3 hours later, I was standing in the cargo bay of my ship, watching 3 Zephyrian cubs systematically destroy everything I owned, while Bert provided unhelpful commentary. The small one appears to have developed a particular fondness for your emergency rations, Captain, Bert observed as the smallest cub, who I'd mentally dubbed Munchkin, tore into a protein bar wrapper with the enthusiasm of a tiny furry demolition crew. That's not fondness, Bert. That's vandalism. I watched as the middle-sized cub rascal discovered my toolbox and immediately started batting wrenches around like the galaxy's most dangerous cat toy. And where's the big one? As if on cue, a crash echoed from the direction of my quarters. The largest cub, Chaos, because of course, had apparently decided my sleeping area needed redecorating, in the Zephyrian style, which involved claws. Right, I said, rolling up my sleeves. Time for Plan A. Plan A was simple. Drop the cubs off at the nearest Zephyrian outpost and pretend this whole thing never happened. Easy, clean, and most importantly, someone else's problem. 2 days later, I was standing outside Outpost Kepler 7, holding what I optimistically called a leash, but was really just some cargo netting tied around 3 increasingly agitated apex predators. "Commander Sarek," I said to the 7-foot-tall Zephyrian officer who was staring at me like I'd just handed him a live grenade. "I believe these belong to you." Commander Sarek looked down at the cubs who were currently hiding behind my legs and making worried little mewing sounds. His expression shifted from confusion to what I could only describe as polite horror. "Human Morrison," he said in that gravelly voice all Zephyrians seemed to have, "these cubs have clearly chosen you as pack leader. This is unprecedented." "Unprecedented is one word for it," I muttered. "Look, I'm sure this is all very touching, but I'm a cargo pilot, not a daycare center. Surely you have facilities for orphaned cubs." Sarak's ears flattened against his skull. Never a good sign with Zephyrians. "You do not understand, human. In our culture, the bond between cubs and their chosen pack leader is sacred. To break it would be—" He paused, searching for words. "It would damage them permanently." I looked down at the 3 cubs, who were now purring and rubbing against my legs like the galaxy's most dangerous house cats. Munchkin looked up at me with those huge golden eyes, and I felt something in my chest that I absolutely did not want to identify. "So you're telling me," I said slowly, "that I'm stuck with them?" "It would appear so, yes." "And there's no Zephyrian equivalent of foster care?" "Cubs who lose their pack leader typically join extended family units. However, these cubs have rejected that option by choosing you." I stared at Sarek. He stared back. The cubs continued purring. "This is insane," I said finally. "I don't know the first thing about raising Zephyrian young. I eat cereal for dinner, and my idea of childproofing is hiding the good snacks." "Perhaps," Sarek said with what might have been the ghost of a smile, "they will teach you as much as you teach them." And that's how I found myself back on my ship with 3 apex predator children and a growing suspicion that my life had just taken a very sharp left turn into completely uncharted territory. "Torture," I said as I watched Chaos attempt to groom Rascal while Munkin tried to help by pouncing on both of them. "Remind me why I became a pilot." "According to your service records, Captain, you wanted freedom, adventure, and to see the galaxy." I watched Munchkin successfully tackle his siblings into a purring pile of fur and claws. "Next time I want adventure, just shoot me instead." 2 weeks into my unplanned career as an interspecies foster parent, I was starting to think maybe this whole situation wasn't completely terrible. Sure, my ship looked like a hurricane had hit it, and yes, I was spending more on food than fuel, but the cubs were actually pretty good company. Chaos had figured out how to help with basic maintenance, Rascal had appointed himself ship's security officer, and Munchkin was excellent moral support. Then the universe decided to remind me why optimism is a luxury I can't afford. "Captain Morrison," came the voice of Admiral Torres over the comm, and I could tell by her tone that my day was about to get significantly worse. "We need you to report to Station Omega immediately. Priority Alpha." Priority Alpha. In military speak, that meant drop everything and get your butt over here because the galaxy is probably ending. "Admiral," I said while Chaos helpfully tried to groom my hair, "I'm currently dealing with a delicate situation involving some Zephyrian refugees. Can this wait?" "Negative, Captain. This concerns all Zephyrian forces. We have a problem." 3 hours later, I was sitting in a briefing room that smelled like disinfectant and disappointment, with 3 cubs hidden in a cargo crate, because apparently military stations have policies about bringing apex predators to classified briefings. Who knew? Admiral Torres looked like she hadn't slept in a week, which in my experience meant either someone had declared war on everyone simultaneously, or the coffee machines were broken. Given the expression on her face, I was hoping for the latter. "Gentlemen," she began, addressing the room full of officers and looking directly at me when she said it. "Never a good sign. 48 hours ago, the hegemony deployed a new bioweapon against Zephyrian forces in the Centauri system." She clicked a remote and a holographic display showed what looked like a normal space battle. Zephyrian fighters engaging hegemony cruisers. Standard stuff. Then, something changed. The Zephyrian ships just stopped. "The weapon appears to target Zephyrian brain chemistry. Specifically," Torres continued, "it induces a state of complete paralysis through what their medics describe as overwhelming existential terror. For a species that has never experienced fear, the psychological impact is devastating." I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. How many casualties? Entire fleets, Morrison. They're dropping out of hyperspace and just floating there. Crews completely catatonic. We've lost contact with 6 systems in the past day alone. The room was silent, except for the sound of military officers trying to process the magnitude of what they were hearing. I was trying to process something else entirely. The fact that there were 3 Zephyrian cubs currently playing hide-and-seek in a cargo crate who might be the only members of their species not paralyzed by fear. "Admiral," said Colonel Hendricks, a man who looked like he'd been carved out of granite in disappointment. "What's our tactical response?" "That's the problem, Colonel. Without Zephyrian forces, we don't have a tactical response. Their ships, their warriors, their entire military structure is based on fearlessness. Take that away, and they're helpless." I raised my hand, feeling like an idiot. Admiral? Hypothetically speaking, what if there were Zephyrians who weren't affected by this weapon? Torres fixed me with a stare that could have melted titanium. "Morrison, if you know something relevant to this briefing, now would be an excellent time to share it." So I told them. About the cubs, about the crash, about the past 2 weeks of the galaxy's most dangerous babysitting assignment. By the time I finished, every person in that room was staring at me like I'd just claimed to have invented faster-than-light travel using nothing but rubber bands and wishful thinking. "You're telling me," Torres said slowly, "that you've been harboring 3 Zephyrian cubs on your cargo ship for 2 weeks, and nobody thought to mention this in your flight reports?" "In my defense, Admiral, adopted space cats isn't usually relevant to cargo manifests." Torres rubbed her temples. "Morrison, bring them here, now." 20 minutes later, I was back in the briefing room with 3 very curious cubs who were absolutely fascinated by all this shiny military equipment. Chaos immediately tried to investigate a holographic projector, Munchkin started sniffing everyone's boots, and Rascal took one look at Colonel Hendricks and decided this was the perfect time for a nap. "Daily seem remarkably calm," observed Dr. Klein, the xenobiologist who'd been called in for consultation. "Yeah, well, they've been exposed to my cooking for 2 weeks. I'm pretty sure they're immune to everything at this point." Dr. Klein ran some quick scans while the cubs treated the whole thing like an interesting game. When the results came back, the room went very, very quiet. "Admiral," Dr. Klein said, his voice barely above a whisper, "they're completely immune. Not just resistant. Immune. Their brain chemistry shows none of the markers that the bioweapon targets." I looked down at Munchkin, who was currently trying to untie my shoelaces with the dedication of a tiny furry lockpick. "So what you're telling me is that my 3 problem children might be the key to saving their entire species?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you, Morrison." I sighed, already knowing where this was heading. "And I'm guessing you want me to do something incredibly dangerous and probably stupid to help figure out how to replicate their immunity." Admiral Torres smiled, and it was the kind of smile that meant my quiet life as a cargo pilot was officially over. "Morrison, how do you feel about becoming the most important babysitter in galactic history?" 48 hours later, I found myself standing in a hangar bay that looked like someone had crossed a military briefing with a daycare center, watching 3 Zephyrian cubs play with holographic battle plans, while a room full of hardened commandos tried to pretend this was a normal Tuesday. "All right, people," Admiral Torres announced to the assembled crowd of military personnel, scientists, and what I was generously calling my extended family. "Let's go over this one more time. Operation Pacifier is our only shot at ending this war before the hegemony realizes what they've stumbled onto." Commander Thane, the leader of the Zephyri Special Forces unit, stood at attention, despite the fact that his hands were visibly shaking. The bioweapon hadn't affected him as severely as most, probably because he'd been in deep space when it first deployed. But even the legendary Zephyri fearlessness had its limits. "The target," Torres continued, "is the Hegemony Research Facility on Kronos 4. Intelligence indicates this is where they're producing the bioweapon. Our mission is to infiltrate the facility, download their research data, and destroy the production equipment." She paused and looked directly at me. "The problem is that any adult Zephyrian who gets within 50 kilometers of that facility is going to be reduced to a quivering pile of existential dread. Which is where we come in," I said, gesturing to the cubs who were currently engaged in what appeared to be a very serious discussion about the tactical advantages of the ventilation system. "Because apparently I'm now running a daycare for the galaxy's only immune apex predators." Dr. Klein stepped forward, clutching a datapad like it was his only connection to sanity. "The cub's immunity appears to be linked to prolonged exposure to human pheromones and dietary compounds. Captain Morrison's unique lifestyle has somehow altered their brain chemistry enough to make them resistant to the weapon's effects." "My unique lifestyle?" I protested. What's that supposed to mean? Well, sir, your ship's records indicate a diet consisting primarily of synthetic caffeine, processed nutrients, and what you've labeled as emergency chocolate. Combined with human stress hormones and your particular sleep schedule, you're telling me that junk food and insomnia saved the galaxy? In essence, yes. I looked around the room at the collection of military brass, alien commandos, and mad scientists, all of whom were nodding seriously at this revelation. I need a drink. Actually, Captain, Dr. Klein continued, alcohol consumption might further enhance the Cubs' immunity, so please continue your normal routines. This was definitely not how I'd imagined my career going. Commander Thane stepped forward, his voice carefully controlled. Human Morrison, my warriors are compromised. We cannot function effectively in the presence of the bioweapon. But these Cubs, your Cubs, they could be our advanced scouts. I watched Chaos attempting to explain something very important to Munchkin, using a series of chirps and paw gestures that somehow reminded me of a briefing I'd given to rookie pilots. You want me to take 3 children into a heavily fortified enemy research facility. Not just take them, Torres corrected. Lead them. The Cubs won't work with anyone else, and frankly, Morrison, you've got more experience infiltrating impossible situations than half my special ops teams. That's because I keep accidentally stumbling into impossible situations. Exactly, it's like a superpower except incredibly inconvenient and poorly timed. I sighed and looked down at Rascal, who had discovered that military boots made excellent climbing equipment and was currently attempting to scale Colonel Hendricks like a furry, purring mountaineer. What's the extraction plan? Fast and loud, Thane replied. Once you've completed the primary objectives, we'll have a full strike force waiting at the perimeter. The Cubs' immunity should allow them to clear a path for evacuation. And if something goes wrong? Torres and Thane exchanged a look that told me everything I needed to know about the likelihood of something going wrong. Captain Morrison, Torres said carefully, you'll be equipped with the latest stealth technology, full tactical support, and enough firepower to level a small moon. That's not really answering my question. The Cubs are tough, Morrison. Tougher than any of us realized. And they trust you completely. I looked around at the 3 little terrors who had somehow become the most important military assets in the galaxy. Chaos was now attempting to organize the other 2 into some kind of formation, probably based on something he'd observed during our daily routine. Munchkin was listening intently while simultaneously trying to eat a stylus. Rascal had given up on climbing and was now using his claws to improve the grip on Hendricks' boots. You know what the really insane part of this is? I said finally. 3 weeks ago, my biggest worry was whether the coffee dispenser on Deck 7 was broken. Now I'm being asked to take 3 babies into a war zone because they're the only hope for galactic peace. Welcome to military service, Morrison, Torres said with that terrifying smile again. We specialize in turning personal problems into strategic advantages. I knelt down and whistled softly. All 3 Cubs immediately abandoned whatever they were doing and bounded over to me, chirping happily and climbing over each other to get the best spot for ear scratches. All right, you 3, I said, looking into 6 golden eyes that trusted me completely. Looks like we're going to go break some very expensive enemy equipment. Think you can handle that? Chaos chirped once and touched his nose to my hand. Rascal purred and started sharpening his claws on my boot. Munchkin just looked up at me with those enormous eyes and made a sound that somehow conveyed complete confidence in whatever insane plan we were about to attempt. Right then, I said, standing up and addressing the room. When do we leave? And please tell me someone has figured out how to child-proof a stealth shuttle. 12 hours later, I was crouched in a ventilation shaft that smelled like industrial lubricant and regret, watching 3 Zephyrian Cubs discuss infiltration tactics in what I could only describe as aggressive whispering. The Hegemony Research Facility on Kronos 4 stretched out below us through the grating. A maze of laboratories, security checkpoints, and enough armed guards to make this officially the stupidest thing I'd ever attempted. And that was saying something considering my track record. Bert, I whispered into my comm, please tell me you've found the main server room. Affirmative, Captain. 3rd level, Section C7. However, I should mention that there are approximately 47 armed personnel between your current position and the objective. 47, that's it? I was expecting at least 60. The facility appears to be operating with reduced staff, sir, probably because they assume no one would be insane enough to attempt an infiltration. Well, they're about to learn why assuming makes you look stupid. I looked down at the Cubs, who were arranged in what Chaos had somehow determined was optimal formation. All right, team, this is it. Remember the plan. Chaos takes point, Rascal handles security systems, Munchkin watches our backs, and I try not to get us all killed. Questions? Munchkin chirped softly and held up a small device that looked suspiciously like one of the explosive charges from our equipment pack. No, Munchkin, we don't eat the explosives. Those are for the bioweapon production facility. I gently took the device away from him. We've discussed this. The plan was actually relatively simple, which in my experience meant it was about to become incredibly complicated. Phase 1. Infiltrate the research levels and download everything related to the bioweapon project. Phase 2. Plant charges in the production facility. Phase 3. Get out before everything exploded. Phase 4. Try to explain to Admiral Torres why I'd let 3 cubs handle military-grade explosives. We dropped down from the ventilation system into what appeared to be a storage area, filled with equipment I couldn't identify and definitely didn't want to touch. Chaos immediately moved to the door and pressed his ear against it, listening for guards. After a moment, he held up 2 claws. 2 guards outside. I pulled out my stunner and gestured for the cubs to stay back, but Rascal was already moving. He slipped under a storage rack, circled around to the blind spot by the door controls, and did something that involved a lot of sparks and the sudden sound of heavy objects hitting the floor. Emergency lighting failure in Storage Bay 7, came an announcement over the facility's comm system. Maintenance teams respond immediately. Show off, I muttered, but I was grinning as we moved into the corridor. The cubs had turned infiltration into an art form, and honestly, watching them work was like seeing a perfectly choreographed dance performed by tiny, lethal ballet dancers. We made it through the first 2 security checkpoints without incident, mostly because Rascal had developed an unhealthy fascination with the facility's electronic systems, and Chaos had figured out how to mimic the facility's maintenance protocols. By the time we reached the research level, I was starting to think this might actually work. That's when everything went spectacularly sideways. Intruder alert, blared the facility's alarm system. Security breach in Research Section C, all personnel to battle stations. I said, diving behind a lab bench as energy bolts started flying over our heads. Please tell me you have good news. I'm afraid not, Captain. It appears Dr. Vex, the facility's chief researcher, has been monitoring the security feeds personally. He's initiated a facility-wide lockdown. Of course he has. I popped up long enough to return fire at the squad of hegemony soldiers advancing down the corridor. Any chance our extraction team can move up their timeline? Commander Thane reports that his forces are still 15 minutes out, sir. The bioweapons effects are making it difficult for them to approach. Chaos appeared at my elbow, chirping urgently and pointing toward a side corridor. I looked where he was indicating and saw what he'd spotted. A maintenance access that led directly to the server room. Good eye, buddy. All right, new plan. You 3 get to the servers and download everything you can find. I'll hold off our new friends. All 3 cubs stared at me with expressions that clearly said, absolutely not. Look, I know you want to help, but this is the important part. We need that data, and you're the only ones who can get through the facility's defenses without triggering the bioweapon protocols. Munchkin made a sound that was part whine, part growl. I'll be fine, I said, ejecting an empty power cell and slapping in a fresh one. I'm very good at not getting killed. It's like a hobby of mine. Chaos chirped once, touched his nose to my hand, then led Rascal and Munchkin toward the access corridor. I watched them disappear into the facility's maintenance systems and tried not to think about how much trouble 3 unsupervised cubs could get into in a heavily armed research facility. The next 10 minutes were what military historians would probably call tactically challenging, and what I preferred to think of as a really bad day at the office. The hegemony soldiers were well-trained, well-equipped, and had the advantage of knowing the facility layout. I had a stunner, limited cover, and a growing collection of scorch marks on my jacket. Captain Morrison, came Dr. Vex's voice over the facility's comm system. I must congratulate you on an impressive infiltration. However, I'm curious, how exactly did you manage to overcome our bioweapons effects? Trade secret, I called back, ducking as another energy bolt took a chunk out of the wall above my head. But I'd be happy to discuss it over drinks sometime, assuming you surrender and shut down this whole operation. I think not. You see, Captain, I've been monitoring your little pets through our security system. Quite fascinating, actually. 3 Zephyrian cubs, completely immune to our weapon. I imagine they'd make excellent test subjects. That's when I stopped being cautious and started being angry. I said, checking my remaining power cells. Remind me to have a conversation with Dr. Vex about appropriate lab safety procedures. Certainly, Captain. Shall I also remind you that threatening military research personnel is a violation of several galactic treaties? Only if anyone's left to file a complaint. I was about to do something probably heroic and definitely stupid when the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a second later, bathing everything in red, and I heard the sound of very expensive equipment being systematically destroyed. What the hell? Dr. Vex's voice cut off abruptly. Chaos appeared in the corridor, dragging what looked like a data core behind him. Rascal emerged from a wall panel, sparks flying from his claws, and Munchkin bounced out of an access hatch carrying what I really hoped wasn't a critical piece of the facility's life support system. Security breach in the main laboratory, announced the facility's increasingly frantic computer system. Bioweapon production systems offline, containment protocols failing. Did you three just take out the entire research facility? I asked. Chaos chirped proudly and dropped the data core at my feet. Rascal held up a device that was definitely part of the bioweapon production system, now conveniently in several pieces. Munchkin just grinned. And let me tell you, when a Zephyrian cub grins, it's either adorable or terrifying, depending on your perspective. Extraction team inbound, came Commander Thane's voice over my comm. Whatever you did in there, Morrison, the bioweapon field is dissipating. My warriors can move freely. The sound of heavy combat echoed from the facility's upper levels as Thane's special forces engaged the remaining hegemony defenders. I looked down at three very proud cubs who had just single-handedly destroyed the galaxy's most dangerous weapons program. You know what? I said, gathering up the scattered data cores and checking to make sure everyone was intact. I think I'm getting the hang of this whole military operation thing. That's when the facility's self-destruct sequence activated. Or not, I added, scooping up Munchkin and sprinting toward the extraction point. Bert, please tell me we have a way out of here. Commander Thane has secured the landing bay, Captain. However, you have approximately 3 minutes before this facility becomes significantly less structurally sound. Chaos and Rascal kept pace beside me as we ran through corridors filled with emergency lighting and the sound of very expensive things breaking. Behind us, I could hear Dr. Vex screaming something about research protocols and proper scientific methodology. But frankly, I was more concerned with not becoming part of a very large explosion. We made it to the landing bay with 47 seconds to spare, diving through the doors of our extraction shuttle just as the facility's main reactor decided to express its dissatisfaction with recent events. The shockwave hit us as we cleared the atmosphere, but Thane's pilot handled it like the professional she was. Mission accomplished, I reported to Admiral Torres over the comm, watching Kronos 4 become a very pretty firework display in our rear viewport. Bioweapon research facility destroyed, data recovered, and all personnel accounted for. I looked down at three cubs who were curled up in the shuttle's crew seats, exhausted but happy. Chaos had claimed the co-pilot's chair and was making soft purring sounds. Rascal was systematically cleaning his claws, probably removing evidence of what he'd done to the facility's security systems. And Munchkin was fast asleep, still clutching a piece of equipment that definitely wasn't supposed to leave the facility. Outstanding work, Morrison, Torres replied. How are our VIP passengers holding up? They're fine, Admiral, just fine, though I think we might need to have a conversation about appropriate field equipment for cubs their age. Roger that, Morrison. Welcome home. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in what had to be the galaxy's most surreal awards ceremony, watching Admiral Torres attempt to pin a medal on Munchkin while he tried to eat the ribbon. The Galactic Peace Auditorium was packed with dignitaries from 17 different species, most of whom were still trying to process the fact that 3 Zephyrian cubs had essentially ended a galactic war by breaking very expensive things. The Nebula Cross for Distinguished Service, Torres announced to the assembled crowd, is awarded to Chaos, Rascal, and Munchkin of the Morrison Pack for extraordinary heroism in the face of overwhelming odds. The cubs were wearing what someone had optimistically called formal harnesses, but which looked more like tiny tuxedos with built-in safety restraints. Chaos sat perfectly still during the ceremony, because he understood the importance of the moment. Rascal kept trying to groom everyone within reach, because he'd decided the entire galactic leadership needed better hygiene, and Munchkin had discovered that ceremonial medals made excellent chew toys, despite my repeated attempts to explain diplomatic protocol. Captain Morrison, Torres continued, turning to me with that smile that had gotten me into this mess in the first place. The Medal of Exceptional Achievement in Interspecies Relations. Thank you, Admiral, I said, trying to maintain military bearing while Rascal used my leg as a scratching post. Though I should point out that most of the exceptional interspecies relating was done by 3 individuals, who are currently more interested in your ceremonial decorations than your speech. The crowd laughed, which was probably the first time in galactic history that an awards ceremony had been interrupted by comedy. But then, this whole situation had been one long series of firsts. Dr. Klein approached the podium, clutching a datapad that probably contained enough scientific breakthroughs to revolutionize xenobiology. "Ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished beings," he began, "our analysis of the recovered hegemony data has confirmed what we suspected. The bioweapon was specifically designed to target the neural pathways associated with Zephyrin fearlessness. However, the Cub's exposure to human environmental factors, specifically Captain Morrison's lifestyle, created a unique biochemical adaptation." "You're saying junk food saved the galaxy," called out someone from the press section. "In the most technical sense, yes," Klein replied. "The combination of processed nutrients, synthetic caffeine, irregular sleep patterns, and elevated stress hormones created an immunity buffer that protected the Cubs from the weapon's effects." "So basically," I said, "my complete inability to maintain a healthy lifestyle accidentally created the perfect countermeasure to the most dangerous bioweapon in galactic history?" "That's one way to put it, Captain." Ambassador Nix of the Zephyrian Empire stepped forward, all 7 feet of him radiating the kind of formal dignity that made me feel like I should probably stand up straighter. "Captain Morrison," he said in that gravelly voice that all Zephyrians seem to have, "on behalf of the Zephyrian people, I extend our deepest gratitude. Your actions have not only saved our species, but have demonstrated the true meaning of pack leadership." "Ambassador," I said, "I mostly just tried to keep them from breaking everything I owned." "Yes," Nix replied, with what might have been a smile, "that is exactly what pack leadership means." He produced an ornate document that looked like it had been carved from something expensive. "The Zephyrin Council has voted unanimously to grant you full custody of Chaos, Rascal, and Munchkin, along with all the rights and responsibilities of pack leadership. You are now, in the eyes of Zephyrin law, their legal guardian." I stared at the document, then down at 3 Cubs who were currently engaged in what appeared to be a very serious discussion about the tactical advantages of the auditorium's acoustics. Chaos was explaining something important to the other 2, using a series of chirps and paw gestures. Rascal was listening intently while simultaneously trying to improve the grip on his ceremonial harness. And Munchkin was just happy to be included, occasionally contributing what I'd learned were very insightful observations about snack distribution and nap scheduling. "So what you're telling me," I said slowly, "is that I'm officially a single parent to 3 apex predators who just saved the galaxy." "That is correct, Captain Morrison." I looked around the auditorium at the assembled dignitaries, military brass, and press representatives, all of whom were waiting for some kind of profound response to this momentous occasion. The weight of galactic recognition, interspecies diplomacy, and the end of a devastating war all focused on whatever I was going to say next. "Well," I said finally, "I guess I should probably invest in a bigger ship, and maybe some furniture that's actually Cub-proof this time." The crowd erupted in applause, though I wasn't entirely sure if they were clapping for my acceptance speech or for Munchkin, who had just figured out how to make his metal spin and was treating the whole thing like the galaxy's most expensive toy. Later, after the ceremony and the reception, and the seemingly endless series of interviews with reporters who couldn't quite believe the story they were covering, I found myself back on my ship, now officially redesignated as a diplomatic transport vessel, which came with a much better insurance policy and significantly more paperwork. The Cubs were sprawled across the cargo bay in a purring pile of fur and contentment, exhausted from a day of being galactic heroes. Chaos had claimed the spot closest to the environmental controls, because he'd appointed himself ship's systems manager. Rascal was curled up next to the communications array, still serving as our security officer, and Munchkin was fast asleep on a pile of shipping blankets, clutching his metal like a teddy bear. "Elder," I said, settling into my pilot's chair with a cup of what I optimistically called coffee, "remind me how I ended up becoming the galaxy's most reluctant foster parent?" "Well, Captain," Bert replied in his eternally cheerful voice, "you found 3 orphaned Cubs in a crashed escape pod and decided to rescue them instead of leaving them to die alone in space." "Right, so this is all my fault." "I prefer to think of it as an excellent decision that resulted in saving the galaxy and gaining a family, sir." I looked back at the Cubs, sleeping peacefully after a day that had officially made them the most famous children in known space. 3 weeks ago, they'd been orphans floating in a debris field. Now they were decorated war heroes, with their own Wikipedia entries, and probably more social media followers than most heads of state. "You know what the really crazy part is, Bert?" "What's that, Captain?" I wouldn't change any of it. Not the chaos, not the destroyed furniture, not even the time Rascal reprogrammed the waste recycling system to play classical music. I believe that demonstrates excellent pack leadership instincts, sir. Or Stockholm Syndrome. The symptoms can be remarkably similar, Captain. I took another sip of coffee and started plotting our course for the next delivery run. According to my new orders from Admiral Torres, who seemed to think that my unique qualifications made me perfect for specialized diplomatic missions, we had a shipment of medical supplies to deliver to the Outer Rim colonies. Routine cargo work with a side of interspecies relations and 3 co-pilots who treated every flight like an exciting adventure. Chaos stirred in his sleep and made a soft chirping sound, probably dreaming about tactical maneuvers or maybe just wondering if there were any good snacks hidden in the cargo hold. Rascal's ears twitched as he monitored the ship's systems even while sleeping, because apparently security never takes a break. And Munchkin just purred, content in the knowledge that he was exactly where he belonged. "Elder," I said, starting the pre-flight sequence, "set course for the Centauri system, and remind me to pick up some of those protein bars the Cubs like. The ones that cost more per unit than military-grade fuel cells, sir. Those are the ones. And Bert, maybe see if you can find somewhere that sells them in bulk. I have a feeling we're going to be doing this for a long time." As we lifted off from Station Omega, I caught my reflection in the cockpit window and realized I was smiling. 3 months ago, I'd been a cargo pilot who ate cereal for dinner and considered social interaction a necessary evil. Now I was the legal guardian of 3 galactic heroes, a decorated military officer, and according to the press, the human who taught an empire what family means. Not bad for someone whose biggest qualification was an unhealthy relationship with caffeine and an inability to say no to orphans. "All right, you 3, I called back to the cargo bay, even though they were still asleep. "Let's go see what other impossible situations we can accidentally save the galaxy from." From the cargo bay came the sound of contented purring and the soft rustle of 3 cubs who had found something even better than a pack leader. They'd found home. And honestly, so had I.